Good afternoon and welcome back from the break. And thank you for joining our lunch keynote where we will discuss planning for housing equity. My name is Mari Albertson, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Division of Housing and Community Development. And I'm joined today by our speakers, Director John Zeanah, Dr. Carolyn Loh, and Mr. Steve O'Connor. Mr. Zeanah is the Director of the Memphis and Shelby County Division of Planning and Development, where he leads a cross-functional agency responsible for planning, zoning, and building permitting for city and county governments. Director Zeanah has led the development and adoption of the award-winning Memphis 3.0 Comprehensive Plan, the city's first in 40 years. He has also led improvements to that division to the building permitting process, issuance, and building inspections. Dr. Loh is a former practicing planner and is currently an associate professor at Wayne State University. Her research interests include planning practice, the local planning process, planning for equity, plan implementation, as well as spatial analysis. Dr. Loh is currently partnering with the Michigan Association of Planning to study how local governments are including equity issues in their comprehensive plans. And last but not least, Mr. Steve O'Connor is a Senior Vice President for Affordable Housing Initiatives at the Mortgage Bankers Association. He manages the agency's efforts to support affordable housing policy and the business objectives of their members. He is also responsible for outreach to industry groups, consumer organizations, and other key stakeholders. And we certainly appreciate everyone's participation today. So our discussion today centered on how the city can best employ practices to achieve equity. The Division of Housing and Community Development has partnered with the Division of Planning and Development to be currently engaged in the development of a housing policy plan that's intended to set very clear goals for the city's efforts to create and preserve affordable housing over the next 10 years. The housing policy plan will build on Memphis 3.0, along with other recent efforts around fair housing, recovery from the pandemic, housing security, and reducing vacancy. Our panel today will set a framework for action around these planning efforts. So our discussion today will begin with Director Zeanah sharing key findings from the housing policy plan and presenting the Memphis context. He'll be followed by Dr. Loh, who will present comprehensive plan best practices and how they can inform the next step in our work for implementing the housing policy plan. Director Zeanah and Dr. Loh will then further discuss the specific housing issues that have been identified through our policy planning efforts. After that discussion, we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. So please place any questions you have in the chat during the discussion. And then we'll conclude our discussion today with closing remarks and an update from the Mortgage Bankers Association efforts around housing equity from Mr. O'Connor. So thank you so much to our panelists, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Maury. Excited to be here with everybody to talk about planning for housing equity. As Maury mentioned, the Division of Planning and Development has teamed up with Housing and Community Development to work on a joint city and county housing policy plan. This really goes back a few months after the completion of the Memphis 3.0 Comprehensive Plan and implementation of that plan underway. I had a conversation with then Director Paul Young about some of the recommendations in the housing chapter of the comprehensive plan and how we could begin to advance some of those recommendations. And in my mind, I was first thinking about some of the regulatory improvements that we could make to some of the zoning codes and the building codes. But as Director Young and I talked more, we realized that there was a lot of opportunity to align the housing funding programs that we have in the city and county that our two divisions administer. And now with Director Cash having taken over HCD, and of course continuing to work with Deputy Director Maury Albertson, This has been a great opportunity for us as two divisions to collaborate on what I see as an opportunity to dive deeper into the details of how we're implementing the city's comprehensive plan to address housing equity. So the first thing I want to do is to talk a little bit about Memphis 3.0 to set not only the local context for the housing policy plan, but the local context for our planning environment generally. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Loh after that, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about Memphis 3.0 first. As many of you may know, having participated in the comprehensive planning process or followed some of the news about how it's been implemented, Memphis 3.0 is the city's framework for future growth, investment, and planning over the next 20 years. As Mari said, this is the first comprehensive plan that the city of Memphis has done in nearly 40 years. And the reason why that's significant is there are obviously a lot of different decision makers, agencies. There's a lot of different resources and policies, regulatory levers that go into shaping how a city grows and changes over time. Without a centralized framework, a lot of those decisions are made, in separation and silos, and that can often lead to, opposing priorities. It can lead to a diminished impact of resources in the community. And for a city like ours, this is simply something we cannot afford to have as our focus or as our trajectory. We have to have a focus on a centralized framework that binds all of the agencies that have responsibilities for advancing planning implementation throughout the city, so that we can make the best and the most of the resources and policies that are available to us. Our comprehensive plan was adopted by our planning commission. Locally, we call it our land use control board. In February of 2019, our mayor adopted by executive order, which gave direction to agencies, divisions and agencies across city government to do their part to work towards implementation of the plan. And then our city council adopted it in December of 2019. So a little bit of background why we undertook this to begin with, and what was significant about taking on a comprehensive plan when we did. So you may have heard this quoted before, but essentially our population has been relatively flat in Memphis for now going on about 50 years. Our population in 1970 was 623,000 individuals. It peaked shortly after that. In the latest census, we've seen our population estimates decline a little bit since 2010. We're still within that range of 623 to 646,000 population, and again have been in that range for the last 50 years. So our population is flat, and therefore, the majority of our revenue has remained flat as a result. But in order to stabilize the population, particularly going back several decades, the policy of the city was to expand our land area. Between 1970 and today, our land area has grown by 55%. So our revenue has remained basically flat, but our responsibilities in terms of the infrastructure that we have to service and maintain, the areas that have to be served by fire and police and other services, has grown significantly. So that obviously puts a lot of constraints on a city and further underscores the need for a centralized focus on how we plan for our future. Another thing that we looked at going into the planning process was if we were to do nothing, if we were to let the market continue on as it is, what could we expect? And not surprisingly, we knew this going into the planning process, that largely investment in our community was focused in a pretty narrow band of the city, or cone, generally along the Poplar Corridor from the western edge of the city and downtown all the way out to the eastern edge. And what this research showed us was that if we were just to continue on trend, if we were to do nothing, what could we expect? Generally, for that trend to continue. What we understood from this was that left out a lot of communities throughout the city. And that's important too, because whether we like it or not, investment in not just our city but any city is largely driven by private property owners, not the public sector. The public sector has the ability to try to shift investment using different regulatory levers. The public sector has the power of its own revenues to help shift investment in one area or the other, but by and large, investment in a community comes through private property owners. So again, this further underscores the importance of a comprehensive plan to drive that direction for the future. Our city is largely built out. This was another thing that we really wrestled with as we were putting together the comprehensive plan. We're largely a developed city. So anything that we plan going forward affects existing neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods may have occupied housing throughout. They may have a lot of vacancy throughout their neighborhoods. But by and large, anything that any new investment is going to affect an existing community. Where we do have large tracts of vacant land that in the past would have been prime sites for new development, most of those are in industrial areas, or they're in environmentally sensitive areas, and often can be difficult for large-scale redevelopment. So we're dealing primarily with a developed city and the attendant challenges that come with how we reinvest in a developed city. And so with all of that sort of setting the framework for how we approach the strategy of the comprehensive plan, what Memphis 3.0 recommended was that we focus change in particular areas of the city, places that we identified working with the community as anchors, centers of neighborhoods and of the core city, where there was a significant amount of activity or potential activity where the community could come together, when we felt like there was an opportunity to seeing investment in those anchors to positively impact surrounding neighborhoods. And that anchor strategy not only sort of follows selection of where these places are throughout the city, but the comprehensive plan also looks at how the city can change, thinking about form, character, land use, but also thinking about the types of actions and the activities that are necessary to stimulate that change. And understanding that not all places change differently or should change differently or require the same activities or stimuli to affect change. And so one of the elements, or one of the tools that we used within the comprehensive plan was something called degree of change, where we made recommendations about where the public sector should take more of a leadership role, because there may not be as much private market activity at the present time. where the public sector can take a leadership role, not only through the use of its regulations, but by targeting the investment of its resources to help to implement change. So those areas of change, each anchor we identified, also surrounding it, we identified that there's an anchor neighborhood within a quarter and then a half-mile walking distance of the anchor, where there might be more opportunity for infill. There might be more opportunity to add some density to support activities within that anchor area, where there might be opportunities to help better achieve the goal of creating walkable, transit-served communities. And again, each anchor was assigned a degree of change to guide how change is implemented. So the example I gave a moment ago, where the public sector would take more of a leadership role, are in areas that the comprehensive plan called nurture communities, slower growth markets that where the public sector and philanthropic sectors could take a leadership role, both with investment as well as regulation. So there were over 100 anchors that were identified through our public process. We engaged over 15,000 residents of Memphis as we were putting together the comprehensive plan. And primarily what we were looking for through this stage was for communities to reflect on the assets of each of their neighborhoods and where those assets could be built upon to encourage and stimulate new investment activity around their neighborhoods. And again, each of those anchors was identified a degree of change. So you may remember one of the maps that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, where it was thought that if we just leave the market to its own devices, what could we expect? That's largely in the center of this map here, where you see a lot of sort of the lime greens and the darker blues. Those are accelerate and sustain anchors, places where we see the private market taking more of a role. The teals, the light teals, are the nurture anchors, the places where the public sector, the comprehensive plan guides the public sector to take more of a leadership role. And then the plan also, in addition to the strategy, looked at how we associate goals and objectives around things like not only creating complete cohesive communities, but also how that ties in with parks and civic space, how it ties in with transportation and infrastructure, and how it ties in with housing and equitable economic activity to support the plan's goals citywide. So since the adoption of the plan, the implementation has taken on a number of forms. I think perhaps the most visible form, the most notable form that many of the participants today might know about is Accelerate Memphis, the city's $200 million investment in parks and neighborhoods throughout the city. And certainly that is a major way and certainly a groundbreaking way that the city is working to implement its comprehensive plan. But another way that the plan is being implemented is by continuing to plan, and specifically in areas and corridors throughout the city. And so many of you may be familiar with small area plans that my division is working to lead right now. But also we are working on different system plans as well, refining some of the details and how these various systems of our city and our city's infrastructure are shaped in order to adhere and conform to the plan, but also help to implement and advance the plan. The first effort that we undertook was the transit vision, which actually came in concert with the completion of the comprehensive plan. But since then, we've also continued to work on an update to our complete streets plan to align with the comprehensive plan, climate action plan. The city's parks division has led a parks master plan. Our public works division is working on a sewer master plan. Our engineering, public works, and planning and development are working on a new stormwater manual. All of these different system plans help to align the various systems of city government and how it affects the built environment to conform with the comprehensive plan. But just maybe to reflect on why we're here in this convening is based on that discussion that I talked about at the beginning of my remarks with former Director Young, that a housing policy plan was also necessary in order to advance several of the recommendations of the comprehensive plan, but also to allow the city to take a more proactive approach in particularly those nurture anchor areas and how we use investment and how we use regulation to advance investment into many communities throughout the city that where there's not a lot of market activity right now. And again, because my division has a joint city and county role, and in fact, one of the departments under my division is the county's housing department. Using that opportunity, using that leverage to work with the city's housing department, HCD, and combining resources of our two divisions and thus our two government, city and county government, to focus on a more cohesive housing reinvestment policy plan for the city and county. So a few things that really have kind of stood out about the housing policy plan. Why are we undertaking this? This goes beyond just the need to further a comprehensive plan. This goes beyond the need to work together as two divisions and two governments to align our resources around housing. Housing and housing dynamics are always evolving, and we certainly have seen that, particularly within the last 10 years, within our community, and how the need for and the challenges within our housing environment have changed, not only as a result of pandemic, but also as a result of the way that the market has shifted over the last decade. Some of the things that we've seen are, and for example, a large percentage of previously for sale houses flipping to rental housing. So evaluating different dynamics such as that to understand, not only how the needs have changed, but what are the options today, and what can government do to support healthy housing markets in neighborhoods throughout the city and county. Second, understanding what our existing programs, policies, and plans are. Many of the programs that we administer, many of the policies that we administer, they were created at various times, various stages. Housing needs were different when many of these programs were created, and so oftentimes those programs were created with different needs in mind, and certainly with different needs in mind than what our needs are today. So aligning our programs, policies, and plans so that we're meeting the needs that we're seeing today and that we anticipate for the future. And then finally, establishing goals and metrics to measure success so that we have a clear framework in mind, a clear set of goals in mind that we're working towards as a community, and within a certain time horizon. By the end of the next decade, at 2030, we can look back and understand how well did some of our decisions impact the community based on how we thought they would, and how do we shift our strategy based on that impact, but also based on what the housing needs are when we revisit this again in 10 years. So a few key findings that that really stood out to us and have stood out to us as we work through this process that is still very much underway. I think we all are aware of the how many neighborhoods and residents within our city and county have suffered from disinvestment and redlining. In fact, if you all follow the news, you likely saw that just within the last week or so, the U.S. Justice Department has filed a suit against a bank operating within Memphis and Shelby County for allegations of redlining. This isn't simply a relic of decades ago. This is still happening today, and so the impact that we've suffered is not just historic, but it's also present as well. As a result, our housing market is not functional in many areas of our city and county. Our housing market doesn't support production or maintenance of quality housing in many areas of our city and county, and that's a big problem. The city, county, state, nonprofits, and even federal government have multiple programs to preserve and produce affordable housing, but operating sort of in silos, there's limited impact. And so, again, part of the goal here is to align those resources so that we have more direct and clear impact into the community. All towards the goal of establishing healthy housing markets. And then finally, I think we always need to remember that this isn't just about how we use the power of dollars to invest in community, but also how, as government, we use the power of regulation to help influence markets in one direction or the other, again, towards the goal of establishing healthy housing markets. How we're using affordable housing funds today, I mentioned, there's some siloing, but there's also, obviously a wide range of activities that are necessary to support a healthy housing market within the city and county. And so all of these different activities, these 5 major activities, are being covered in some form or the other. And one of the goals of the housing policy plan is to understand how they can be leveraged where there are gaps in terms of how we can address these areas. And this slide kind of breaks down how each of those areas are funded. As you can see, the largest area is in rental assistance. That is almost exclusively done through federal investments. Rental housing also comes in second, but again, the majority of the funding for rental housing is outside of local control. Those dollars are primarily investment by the state. Home ownership is where we see probably the greatest mix of investment across the 4 different funding streams. The state accounting for most of investment in home ownership, but local government and philanthropy also playing a role. And then housing rehabilitation being the other area where the local government at present plays a more of a role. So in terms of supporting home ownership, again, if you recall the last slide, the state plays sort of the most major role, but both the city and the county have down payment assistance programs that help support home ownership within the city and county. And then in terms of housing rehabilitation, again, the city and county both have resources that are at play here. There's also funds and programs that are managed and administered by nonprofits in this area as well that help to invest in healthy housing markets. But if you recall, the amount of dollars for housing rehabilitation, especially in comparison to other types of programs such as rental assistance, is much smaller. So to this point, we have really kind of landed on 4 major recommendations in how we support targeted reinvestment in housing to establish a healthy housing market throughout the city and county. First and foremost, improving housing quality. And Dr. Loh and I, in a moment, will talk a little bit more about that element and how important that is and what some of the challenges are. Second, supporting homeownership. Third, growing missing middle housing. Missing middle housing is somewhat of a new concept, or at least a newly coined term, but the missing middle is a historic type of housing that has grown out of common practice as of late, but creating different housing choices through growing that missing middle is another area of focus of the housing policy plan. And again, Dr. Loh and I will talk about that in a moment. And finally, increasing quality low-income housing, which really ties back to point number one, improving housing quality. The last thing that I just want to note too, and Dr. Loh and I will get into this when we get into our discussion, is you'll note that the sort of top line here is supporting targeted reinvestment. This should really come as no surprise based on the anchor strategy and many of the remarks that I made about the comprehensive plan. With the city as spread out as we are, with revenues being relatively flat, with the challenges that we have with funds available for investment, it's really incumbent upon us to think about how we target our resources towards advancing these goals. And sometimes that can have challenges that go along with it. But ultimately, targeting our investments is going to be maybe a critical, I would put it fifth, but it does deserve its place here on the top line, a critical step in how we advance healthy housing markets within the city and county, certainly in the short term, but in the long term as well. So with that, I'm going to end sharing and turn it over to Dr. Loh for some of her remarks.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here to speak with you and to share some of what I've learned in my research about planning for equity and comprehensive plans. And thank you for that interesting presentation about specifically how the housing policy orientation is working. I'm going to give you a presentation about some of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years working on equity and comprehensive plans specifically. I'm going to try to share my screen here. All right, that's not working, so just a second here. All right, finally got it. Okay, so like I said, over the last couple of years, I've been working with the Michigan Association of Planning, which is our planners professional organization. I'm on their social equity committee, and I've been looking specifically at how we can advance equity goals through comprehensive plans. First, I want to say why equity? I mean, it seems obvious, but besides the sort of moral imperative to make opportunities available for everyone, It's actually from planning theory. It's one of the fundamental goals of planning. So there are supposedly three fundamental goals of planning: economic development, environmental protection, and then equity and social justice. And the real bottom line here is that we can't have a sustainable city if we don't have all of these three things in balance, and we're not working toward all of these three things. And historically, we have done a poor job of focusing on equity and social justice. It's becoming a more talked about and more emphasized one of these planning goals, and that's really exciting, but there's a long way we have to go. And finally, what is equity? People define it in different ways. I would say it's that everyone has the same access to resources, the same quality of life, and the same opportunities in the city. And it doesn't matter where in the city you are geographically, it doesn't matter what your income level is, you have access to all those things. And isn't that what we all want for ourselves and for our neighbors? So I'll just briefly say that I did a study of comprehensive plans in Michigan, and there's a lot of room for improvement. And I will say that the Memphis 3.0 plan is a fantastic plan. It doesn't have the problems that I saw in many of the plans in Michigan. But I will just point out that fewer than half of the plans we looked at mentioned equity, justice, or fairness. So it just wasn't something that a majority of the plans even talked about. Only 42% of the plans that we looked at had a goal that mentioned affordable or workforce or fair share housing, however they wanted to use that language. Fewer than 25% mentioned equitable environmental protection, and Michigan is a coastal state. We also have a lot of issues with urban flooding, and so to not mention that equitable environmental protection is a real omission. And then finally, this was shocking to us, many did not even quantify the demographic breakdown of their communities by race or income. So didn't even know who was living there, who might be vulnerable. And again, the Memphis plan does not exhibit any of these problems, but I'm just letting you know that you really have an exceptional plan, and it's not necessarily the norm nationally to have a plan like that. So how can we plan for equity? I'm going to kind of go over the sort of broad factors that we identified as really important in a comprehensive plan. So first, and I'll talk about each one of these separately, have an inclusive mixed methods process to come up with the plan in the first place, make equity an organizing principle, identify vulnerable people in the city, identify vulnerable geographies. Often those are related, but not always. Make future land use changes more transparent, and integrate equity into every aspect of the plan. So I'm going to go through these one by one. Having an inclusive mixed methods process, we found that of all of the factors that we looked at, this one was the most consistently associated with having a plan with a strong equity focus. So, and it doesn't have to be fancy, but it just means that you try to get to people in different ways at different times through different methods. So not everyone can come to an evening meeting, not everyone can come to a daytime meeting, not everyone has access to the internet. So if you try to reach out to people in different ways and different times, you're more likely to get a wider variety of people. And one of the things that I saw in the Memphis 3.0 plan that I really liked was that the planners and the planning staff, knowing that they don't necessarily have access to communities who might not be as often represented in planning processes, they reached out and partnered with organizations that did have access to those communities. So I really liked what I saw in that, because sometimes the kind of process that's just open to everybody doesn't reach everybody. So I thought that was a really good facet of this planning process. And I just listed here, when I read the plan, I just listed here all of the different methods that the planning staff and consultants and community members use to get community input, and this is really impressive. There are many, many different ways that that you all reached out to people, and I think that's great. So as an outsider looking at the plan, it looks to me like this really was an inclusive mixed methods process. It looks like it really did get a great cross-section of community members and their opinions about the future of the city. Make equity an organizing principle. So be really explicit about it. Talk about equity. Don't try to kind of hide it, and really say, this is what we're about. This is an important goal of ours. This is how we're going to go about it. And your plan does this. So in the introduction, it talks about expanding equity. It also has an equity goal. So not every plan does, but Memphis's plan does, which is great. So again, this is something you don't always see. And this is really an important signal as to what this plan is trying to do. Another issue is to identify vulnerable people. So this is a map from your plan that looks at poverty and social inequity. And it's really geographically distributed, as you can see. So I'm going to talk in a minute about vulnerable geographies, but vulnerable people can potentially be anywhere. And who are vulnerable people? They may be people who are low income. They may be people who have less education. They may be people who have disabilities. So anybody who maybe needs an extra hand, maybe has extra set of challenges in accessing opportunities and supporting themselves. It's important to know who that is in your city. Who are the vulnerable people? What do they need? And where are they? If you don't know, if you don't identify them in general, in aggregate, then how can you be sure that when you're making investments, you're helping people who need help? And that's one of the big, in my mind, one of the biggest problems with the plans that we were looking at is that they just didn't even ask. They didn't find out who was there. Identifying vulnerable geographies. This can be a combination of social vulnerability and also environmental vulnerability. Like I said, we have a lot of issues up in Michigan with urban flooding. We built our cities over streams, and the streams are coming back. And that's happening all throughout the US, including, I imagine, in Memphis. And I really like this map on the left from one of the plans that we looked at, the city of Bridgman, which is a tiny city on the west coast of Michigan, on Lake Michigan. And they did some modeling and some mapping to say, all right, where are the flooding issues likely to be in the future? We know that the weather is getting weirder and worse. And so the places that are okay now may not be okay in the future. So I think even the Memphis plan could even go a step further. This is a map of Memphis from the First Street Foundation that shows the potential for flooding events. And you can kind of see, you know, there are historic streams there too that are trying to kind of reassert themselves. So I think just being really transparent about here's where we see a risk. Another issue, of course, for everywhere, but even more in the southern part of the US is, of course, extreme heat events. And so looking at things like tree canopy, looking at areas with a large amount of pavement that can end up getting hotter, that's another thing that's really important to look at. And, you know, I saw some more discussion of this in your climate action plan too. It's a little less so in the comprehensive plan. And again, just transparency about this. Here's what we know. Here's what we think might happen. We don't know for sure, but this is what it's looking like. And so here's who we think might be possibly in harm's way in the future. Make future land use changes more transparent. This is something that many of the plans do a really terrible job with, and your plan does a pretty good job with it. This is a table from the city of Midland, Michigan, and it just lays out how they're changing the land use distributions. It doesn't actually show you where, but it does say, here's what we're doing in the future. From your plan, and Director Zeanah already showed this same map, what I really liked was being transparent about which neighborhoods are likely to experience more and less change, and what types of change. So you can, if you live in one of these neighborhoods, you can say, all right, there's things that are going to be happening in this neighborhood, and I shouldn't be surprised. So I thought that was good. one of the things that we are going to do in our research is look at where they were putting new multifamily housing and whether or not it was adjacent to transit. And in most cases, we couldn't tell. So the land use maps and the discussion and the relationship to transit were not nearly as clear as they should have been. And that's something that your plan does really well, actually. And then finally, integrate equity into every part of the plan. Make sure people can read the plan. If you have people in your community, like a large population that speaks another language besides English, make sure that plan gets translated. Make sure it's easy to read, it's written in plain English. Like I said, make equity an organizing principle of the plan. Show the demographics, show who lives there, where do they live? Housing and land use, this is obvious, but apparently not. Include housing goals and objectives that provide for housing for all ages and income levels. And Director Zeanah and I are going to talk about that more in a minute. Transportation, again, this was a really great part of your plan where it talks about especially bus access for different parts of the city and how reasonably you can get to different parts of the city from different neighborhoods. Environment, hazards, and safety. It's a good idea for the plan to talk about crime. Are there kind of environmental design choices that could be changed to help make different neighborhoods safer? Natural and human caused hazards. Are there polluting industries that are affecting some part of the city? It's important to note those. Community facilities. Does everybody have good access to parks? Does everybody have good access to the kind of city offices that they might need to visit? Food security, food access is becoming a bigger part of planning that people are thinking about. It's a good idea to have that in the plan. And then economic development. Economic development has kind of undergone a sea change in the last decade or so, thinking about, instead of trying to attract factories or offices, and thinking about how does it change people's experience in the neighborhood. And so having that orientation is really important. And then, like I said, making future land use choices transparent. Now, is all this easy? Not necessarily. Like Director Zeanah was saying, we can't do everything at once. And we don't have enough money to invest everywhere at once. And so there are some neighborhoods that are going to get more and some neighborhoods that are going to get less. That's hard. There are some neighborhoods who've historically gotten a lot who are not going to get as much. That's also hard politically. So those are tough conversations. What can kind of help insulate the process from that is having that big conversation on the front end, like you did with your Memphis 3.0 plan, and having those conversations and saying, we've only got so many resources, what are our priorities? Planning capacity and resources, it seems like a great setup here where a lot of different agencies are working together very well. That's something that we don't see enough of, so I'm really encouraged and excited to see that here. Data, sometimes lower capacity places just don't have access to the data they would need to do some of this stuff. It seems like that's not an issue at all in Memphis. It seems like a very well-run ship and a place that has a lot of sophistication in terms of its analysis. Implementation, sometimes you have this great plan and this great process, and then you kind of run out of steam. But again, I don't see that as an issue here because there's a lot of very explicit implementation work going on, and I'm excited to see you continue that. And then finally, equity in cities with high population loss. So I work in Detroit, and we are also a sort of geographically enormous city with kind of close to a third now of our largest population size. And that is a really tough situation. So we have property markets that aren't really functioning properly. We have a lot of predatory lending. We have an older housing stock that was sort of poor quality to begin with and hasn't been maintained. So those are big, big challenges. I'm going to leave that there for a minute, and Director Zeanah and I are going to talk about that more. But there's lots of good news because there are so many things that we can do. So when we do investments, we can make sure that they work on a couple of different levels. So if we're going to put in a playground, we can make sure that it helps with the stormwater. We can do very targeted investments to make neighborhoods feel much more invested in and much more lived in and improve the quality of life. And that can help spur private investments, because it has to be a mix between public and private investment, because public investment just isn't enough. We just don't have the resources. Emphasizing shared values. We want our neighbors and ourselves to have access to these things. We want everyone to have a good quality of life. We care about the safety of kids, and we care about the safety of elderly people. There are so many things that we all really agree on that we kind of need to emphasize those as the foundation going forward. And then it doesn't cost anything to change the zoning code to make things like missing middle housing, workforce housing, mixed use developments easier and cheaper to do. So that's a just about completely free thing that we can do from the government side to make this more easy to do. And then finally, it's so important that you did this plan and that you keep revisiting it. So going 40 years or whatever without a plan is terrible. And Detroit has done the same thing. That can never happen again, because when you get far away from your plan, you start making these ad hoc decisions, and there's no accountability to that equity emphasis, that equity goal that the plan states. So keeping us honest, keeping us on track for equity is a function of the plan partly, and so the plan has to be updated. Just want to give you a link to some of the work that this talk is based on, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you. Okay, so that was mostly what I wanted to share. I'm going to try to get my camera to start working again here. Okay. So yes, I'd like to kind of have that conversation now if Director Zeanah wants to come back.
All right, thank you, Dr. Loh. Well, first, I think I should thank you for all of the very kind and generous things that you said about our plan. I certainly am proud of the accomplishments we've made as a city, and I should have noted in my remarks too that not only is Director Ashley Cash the new Director of Housing and Community Development, but in her most previous job, she was the administrator of the Comprehensive Planning Department under our division, and was a driving force behind the comprehensive plan. So between the two of us, hopefully there will be no excuse not to continue to update the plan over time. I want to kind of shift the discussion back to touch on some of some of the housing related themes that both of us have discussed. You sort of left, you put a pin in a statement that you were making about, some of the issues related to housing quality in Detroit. And, I think that there are some similarities between Memphis and Detroit as it relates to housing quality and stock. I think if reflecting back to when, as far as I can remember and starting and planning in Memphis, one thing that I recall or can think of as a consistent theme that people have said is that Memphis doesn't necessarily lack affordable housing, but really quality affordable housing. And I think a lot of the data that we've seen in the housing policy plan, bears that out. One of the data points that we uncovered is that roughly 80% of the housing stock in Memphis is affordable at the city and county's area median income, which obviously is generally an affordable, a statistic of affordability. But when you consider things like the age of the housing stock, you consider things like lack of reinvestment over time. You consider the fact that our poverty rate is roughly double the national average. All of this is I think, an unfavorable recipe for sustaining housing quality stock. And a lot of cities have kind of taken, maybe one of two paths. One, removing the blight, where there is housing stock that has deteriorated past a certain point. Addressing that acute issue of removing the blight. But I guess on the flip side, there's potentially some long-term harm that could make, especially when you compound that over multiple units, destabilizing a community. But the other path is how we are reinvesting in some of that stock. I think one of the challenges there too is when you think of from the market perspective, investing in a home that may not necessarily have a higher value, could potentially leave a property underwater in terms of fair market value, and how to sort of juggle that conundrum as a city. So I'm curious to hear some of your reactions to not only maybe some of those assumptions or findings, particularly in Detroit, but also other areas that you've studied. And then maybe, have you seen other cities solve some of these really thorny challenges to reinvest in a healthy housing stock?
Yeah, so I think what you're describing sounds very familiar from the context that I'm familiar with. Detroit has a ton of housing that's inexpensive, but it's poor quality, and so it's a bad value. So that's it's not that you couldn't afford it; it's that it's not getting you much for your money. There are houses that in our area we have a lot of issues with lead in houses. We have houses that have unsafe wiring, things like that. So it's not even just that they're unpleasant; they're actually even unsafe. So I think one of the things that you and I were going to talk about is this missing middle housing concept, and I think that's a key factor for a couple of reasons. One of the things you mentioned, and I'll get back to the housing quality thing in a second, one of the things you mentioned was that there's not a lot of large areas of land suitable for redevelopment in Memphis. And the missing middle housing, those are duplexes, fourplexes, sometimes townhouses, sometimes live-work units. The plan has a great illustration. They just don't take a lot of land, and they can be put up by a small investor. So you don't need huge amounts of land assembly. We have a lot of issues with clouded title in Detroit, so just even figuring out who owns the land and are there liens on it. So if you manage to find a couple of parcels, you could do some relatively small scale investment in this missing middle category. And so so another thing that this missing middle category helps with is increasing density. It sounds like Memphis is also a pretty low density city like Detroit. Detroit doesn't have the same kind of like brownstones or the kind of brick row houses that like a St. Louis or a Chicago or Baltimore does. We have a lot of single family houses, not so many apartment buildings. And so it's just really, really low density and spread out. And that makes it hard when you want to invest in a neighborhood and you want to kind of really get an anchor, kind of some traction. You just don't have a lot of density of people. And so again, that missing middle housing can help with that density. So, and then coming back to the housing quality issue, if you get some investments, you get some of that new density, some of that activity focused around anchor, new quality housing. and not even necessarily new affordable housing. I know that's part of one of your prongs, but there also needs to be new market rate housing for any of this to work. Then it can be more attractive to reinvest in some of that older housing. So some of it's never going to get invested in. Some of it's kind of too far gone, had experienced too many years of poor maintenance. But some of it, the kind of cost benefit analysis will work out eventually if the neighborhood starts to get kind of revived by some new housing investment and some of that city public investment in streetscapes, in sort of placemaking at the anchor level.
Great. I appreciate you touching on missing middles some there and the role that it can play. And one of the things I wanted us to first kind of touch on was what is missing middle, and you described that well.
Yeah, and I should say also, I think a lot of people think it's missing middle has to do with income, the income of the people who might live there. And it's possible, but it really has more to do with the size of the structures. So is it, we've got single family houses on one end and we've got big apartment complexes on the other end, and we've got this stuff in the middle that blends in really well to an otherwise single family neighborhood, but gives you a little bit more density and a little bit more affordability because you're dividing up the cost of that property between more than one family or more than one household. So sorry to jump in.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you mentioning too that the scale of it often can fit so much better in a single family neighborhood or abutting a single family neighborhood, especially, I think it's a good housing style to use as a transition between, an apartment complex, apartment building, and single family housing. But it also could be suitable along more of a commercial corridor, right adjacent to an anchor, that might have some commercial uses, and then still sort of fit within the single family community. So one thing we probably ought to touch on, though, why is it missing? We keep saying missing middle housing. So why is it missing?
Well, for a long time, in many places, it hasn't been allowed. That's one reason. So our zoning codes have X'd it out from the possibility. So we have zones that allow single family housing only. We have zones that allow multifamily housing, which tend to be bigger apartment complexes. And then we haven't really thought about integrating this kind of medium density housing into other neighborhoods or even in their own neighborhood. So one big reason is we've prohibited it.
Yeah,
that's something we can fix like today. So.
It is, and there I think probably one of the headline stories in the planning world, at least over the last year or so, has been Minneapolis and their move to eliminate single family housing, exclusive single family housing zoning districts from their zoning code. And there are other cities that have followed suit as well. They're certainly not alone now. One of the I think one of the challenges, though, I teach land use controls at the University of Memphis, and the first course of the semester, we start with an article about how Minneapolis ended single family zoning. And what we haven't really gotten into is why hasn't, as a result, missing middle kind of taken off. And one of the things that has been highlighted as well is, it's not just about the use, it's also about the bulk regulations, the setbacks, the lot sizes, and that sort of thing too. And as we've gone into our housing policy plan discussions, and particularly thinking about what are regulatory things that we could do, we've paid special attention to thinking about how lot sizes play a role in also limiting housing options as well. Another thing too that if I may just kind of chime in, because you're right, the restriction in zoning has been a big part of what has made it missing. Another thing that is often, maybe not talked about by planners because it's in the building code, is that, we have a building code that is, made for single family and two family, the residential code, which is much less onerous to follow and use, but also less costly to comply with than the commercial code. And the commercial code encompasses everything from commercial buildings, industrial buildings, but all the way down to triplexes as a residential use. And so that has been a hindrance in many communities too, to seeing missing middle because it's really cut out a lot of potential builders who home builders who could very easily take a single family prototype and do, say, a quadplex within that prototype, but having to make that jump between the residential code and the building code has often been a hindrance. And that's actually a recommendation that we identified within the comp plan, and that we've been working on getting amended within our building code here locally, is allowing single structures between 3 and 6 units to be reviewed as a residential project as opposed to a commercial project. But I think also there's programmatic issues too. We need more builders, we need more investors in that type of housing, and obviously codes play a big part in limiting it, but they also kind of play a big part in having diminished the potential builders and investors. And it's one, I think, very encouraging thing that I've seen in Memphis within the last couple of years is a lot of local groups, and particularly our local chapter of ULI, and in many ways working with a lot of nonprofit housing developers, looking at how we can expand incremental development, expand small scale developers to be able to do some of these different missing middle housing types.
Yeah, and I think maybe our last speaker can speak to this a little bit, but I think once, if you go many decades with that being a type of housing that no one is really building, getting a loan for that type of housing, building that type of housing could be more complicated. It's just people are like, well, what is this? I haven't seen this kind of product before. I don't really know what this is. Is this viable? I'm not sure. So I think just getting back in the habit of thinking that that's a normal thing to be building is important. And I think the idea of making the regulatory and building department burden less, that's always a lever that local government has, right? Is time is money when you're building. And so if you can make something, make the process go faster to get an approval, that's huge. That can maybe not make or break it, but that can help tip the balance into whether it's a profitable project or not. And of course, in the private sector, like you're doing this, partly out of the goodness of your heart, but also you wouldn't be able to keep doing it if you didn't also make a profit. So,
yeah, absolutely. So I want to make sure that we have enough time for our last speaker, Steve, to chime in with his comments. But I know we wanted to take some questions, so this might be a good place to pause and see if there are any questions. And I'm maybe looking back towards Deputy Director Albertson to let us know if there are any questions that, for Dr. Loh or for me that we can answer before we turn the program over to Steve.
Sure. Thank you. And first, thank you both so much for your great presentations. And that was really good conversation. While we're pulling up some of the questions from the chat, I had a couple of questions that came to mind. I guess keeping an equity lens in mind, are there certain data or benchmarks that we can consider in determining the best mix of affordability and market rate units in a neighborhood?
Dr. Loh, would you like to take that?
I don't think I have a number for you. One thing that we know is that building more market rate housing units trickles down to provide more affordable housing units at the bottom. So, you know, we often have an issue when people build new housing and people are upset because it's luxury housing, or it's, you know, it seems out of reach for kind of the people who are really the most in need of housing. And they're not wrong, but all of that means is, you know, yesterday's luxury housing is today's kind of medium housing, and, you know, 30 years ago, luxury housing is now affordable. So when you put more units into the mix, assuming you have, you know, not a completely out of whack supply and demand situation, you end up with more availability at the affordable level as well. So I would say, you know, whatever the city can do to encourage the building of new market rate housing, that's going to end up helping everybody.
Thank you. I guess oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's along the lines of what I was thinking as well. You know, I'm not sure that within the housing policy plan we certainly haven't arrived at a number in terms of the mix, and I don't expect that we will. But Dr. Loh, I think your comments are you know, right along the lines of what where our direction is headed. That, you know, it's important for us to think about the range of options and housing choices, and not necessarily try to, you know, hit some, you know, percentage split between market rate and affordable. As I mentioned, you know, in one of my statements, one of the data points that we have looked at is that, you know, roughly 80% of houses within Memphis and Shelby County are affordable at 100%. You know, at the 100% area median income. So, you know, building more of a mix of housing choices and a range of housing choices, I think, helps to address that need of affordability and sort of a variety of quality affordability, both at the ownership and rental level, without necessarily, you know, trying to arrive at some sort of perfect balance between the two.
I think the other thing I would say is that there are different housing unit types. You know, affordability is one issue and it's an important issue, but there are different housing unit types and locations that are more and less useful for people at different life stages too. So again, we in Detroit have largely single family homes. And not everybody wants a single family home, and not everyone, you know, at different points in their life. So I think one thing we know from planning research is that communities that have a wide range of housing types are more resilient economically. You can't ever know for sure what type of housing mix you're going to need in the future. So if you have a mix, you're going to be more likely to be able to provide what people need, instead of if you have just kind of one type of thing and that becomes a thing that people don't want. So I think if you're, you know, thinking about price ranges is really important, but also thinking about life stages is important too.
All right, thank you. So one last question, and we'll make sure to give Mr. O'Connor plenty of time to close us out. Dr. Loh, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that, you know, there was a striking number of plans that you reviewed across the plans that you reviewed that really lacked any discussion or recognition of equity at all. So I'm sure that's common across the country. So what strategies, and this is to both of you, can you recommend to really encourage municipalities and other planning entities to include an equity focus in their plans? What are some of the benefits it brings to their community? How can we use different carrots to encourage that kind of information to be included in plans?
Yeah, well, one of the things is what I just said about thinking about life stages. So there are some communities that are really ready and excited to talk about equity and really want to get into that. And then there are some communities where they're not quite there yet on that conversation. But one thing that people are typically pretty receptive to is the idea that at some point they might want a different type of housing for themselves or for their neighbors. And so, that housing that works for people in different life stages also works at different income levels. And so I think that's one way where I've sort of like driven a little wedge in to try to start talking about that housing type, because I kind of care why they would allow different housing types, but I kind of don't, as long as they do it. I'd rather they did it because they wanted to do the right thing, but they're not required to want to do the right thing to do the right thing, I guess.
Yeah, I'll just add, maybe to go back to the first point that you made in your presentation, Dr. Loh, just the importance of any community conducting a comprehensive plan to think about what equitable inclusion into the process looks like for their community. We certainly, as a planning office, had a lot of role in shaping the process of creating the comprehensive plan. But we didn't arrive at the conclusions we did on our own. We arrived at the conclusions that we did, not just in partnership with the community, but oftentimes at the direction of the community. So I think the first point that you made about incorporating equity into a plan is probably the strongest one, that ensuring that your planning process is inclusive, equitably, including the population and the various groups and vulnerable populations of the community equitably is so important to ensuring that the outcomes of not only what gets written into the plan, but also what's implemented from the plan impacts your community equitably.
Yeah, thank you for saying that again. I think, yes, you cannot underscore too much how important that is. And that's another thing where I think that's another little kind of like foot in the door. If you can convince a community that they should have an inclusive process, most people are receptive to that. And so then that process can really open up these conversations that are so important in making sure that the plan is working for everybody, the policies are working for everybody.
Right, great advice. Thank you again so much. We really appreciate your participation today. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Mr. Steve O'Connor to share some of the efforts that the Mortgage Bankers Association has going on. Thank you, Mr. O'Connor.
Great, thanks for having me. And I really enjoyed that discussion. Obviously, housing equity is a critically important issue, and I applaud the work that Memphis has done and enjoyed hearing Dr. Loh's insights. So, look, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about some work we're doing through the Mortgage Bankers Association with a lot of stakeholders and partners in the Columbus ecosystem that really speaks to the issue of housing equity. So the Mortgage Bankers Association, if you don't know who we are, we're a 108-year trade association. We represent predominant lenders in the single-family, multifamily, and commercial space, but also a lot of vendors and law firms and appraisal firms and title firms and other members of the value chain as you create mortgages and then services mortgages. But in March of 2020, in concert or in partnership with the Tennessee Housing Development Agency, THDA, we launched an initiative called Convergence Memphis. There was an event held at the University of Memphis. A large number of stakeholders, many of the partners on this program were in attendance at the event are involved in Convergence Memphis. It's a multi-year cross-sector partnership with the goal of increasing African-American homeownership in Memphis. We have a goal of increasing it by 5 percentage points by the end of the year of 2025. So it's a long-term initiative, because to move the needle on these challenges is going to take time. It's going to take an investment of resources and talent and effort. But we think we've got a good infrastructure to do something meaningful in this area. So it's really three sectors that have come together. As I mentioned, THDA, the city of Memphis, Shelby, what I would call the public sector has a seat at the table, very involved both in design and the execution of the initiative. Then we've got the nonprofit community, CDCs, housing counselors, others. Again, many of our partners are from the nonprofit community are part of today's program. And then, of course, we have the industry. We have lenders. We have real estate agents and brokers. We have national partners like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Cincinnati, CoreLogic. And the idea is to come together and to collaborate, be strategic, be dynamic, and work together as partners, really focused on a couple of key barriers to minority home ownership. One is the information gap, where people are self-selecting out of the market because of misinformation and myths, thinking you need 20% down or perfect credit. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we bridge the trust gap? Often in certain communities, there's a lack of trust or reluctance to trust formal financial institutions, but they will trust other intermediaries. And so how can we partner with the right stakeholders to bridge the trust gap? Then there's a resource gap, and predominantly we're talking about things like down payment assistance, a lot of subsidies and resources that are in the marketplace, but people don't know they're available or don't know how to access or use them. And it's not just consumers, we're talking about loan officers, real estate agents, counselors. So how do you deal with the resource gap? And the last piece, and this has come up in some of the prior discussions, the market gap. And John spoke to a little bit about it a little bit in terms of inventory, not just the amount of inventory available at the right price points, but the quality. And so we have an initiative to try to, as part of Convergence Memphis, deal with some of the inventory challenges through a pilot program that CoreLogic is leading with some of our partners. And John's been involved in some of that at the preliminary stages. And so, when we look at the market environment in Memphis, we think there's a target-rich environment, a large number of mortgage-ready consumers, if we can just figure out how to bridge the information and trust gap and align it with the resources and the inventory. And Freddie Mac did some analysis for us, large cohort of mortgage-ready borrowers and a large cohort of near-ready borrowers with some counseling and coaching and education can become homeowners in the next couple of years. So we're really focusing, as part of our effort, is trying to align a culturally competent set of messages with the right messengers, and then ultimately connecting that to the programs and products that will help somebody transition into home ownership if that's their goal. So again, this is a multi-year initiative, and we're very pleased by the progress we made. We were, thrown a curveball. As I mentioned, we launched in March of 2020, and of course, the pandemic essentially shut down in-person events by and large, like within a week after our launch event. So we went to a virtual environment, but we actually benefited from that because we spent a lot of time building a very elaborate infrastructure, doing a lot of stakeholder engagement. And then by the end of 2020 last year, we started to do community engagement events, virtual homebuyer fairs. We had one in December last year, one in April of 2021, and one again in August of 2021. And so we hope to begin doing more in-person events, go from the virtual to the in-person to engage more of the residents and the stakeholders, and really, with our partners, make an impact over the next couple of years on this critically important issue of advancing African-American homeownership in the Memphis community. If you're interested in being involved in our work, you can Google Convergence Memphis, or you can Google the Mortgage Bankers Association Convergence Memphis. It will come up, and you can see on the Convergence Memphis website, there is a link which you can use to send an email if you're interested in becoming involved. And we, monitor that email account on a regular basis, and we'll be sure to reach out to you. And if you want to be involved, whether it's through one of our many work streams or work groups that we have, or our lender working group, there are a lot of different opportunities. And when you look at the website, you can see that. But what we would love to have as many of the stakeholders in the Memphis community working with us on this important goal. I do need to talk a little bit about transition for the rest of the program. That's kind of my housekeeping duty as I wrap up this particular segment. But I do want to get back to Dr. Loh's question about lenders being familiar with financing structures beyond kind of the traditional single family unit structure. And it is a more complicated financing transaction, no doubt about it. And there are lenders who specialize in that. But one of the things we're trying to do with our pilot initiative that CoreLogic is leading in Convergence Memphis is to take some of the friction out of the planning, development, and approval process, to take some of that risk out of it for the builders and developers and even lenders, and also take some of the financing risk out of it with an empirically demonstrated business case around the highest and best use of land and the types of structures that would make sense, with an eye toward looking at ways to not only create more single family detached housing, but also 2 to 4 unit complexes and other units that would help address that missing middle dynamic that both Dr. Loh and John spoke about. And so as we get ready to transition to the next session, let me just tell you what our housekeeping notes tell me to say. So we're going to be doing a short 15-minute break. And during this time, you're invited to visit the virtual exhibit hall located in the expo area on the left-hand menu, where you can learn more about housing and community development agencies. And you're also welcome to meet with other participants of the summit in the networking area. So a chance to learn and a chance to network. And then please remember to answer the polling questions that come up at the end of this session. And then I want to remind you that you have 3 breakout sessions to choose from at 1:45. You have one entitled Getting the Rising Tide to Lift All Neighborhoods, and a second one entitled Connecting the Dots, Education, Housing, and Place, and then a third breakout session titled Addressing Blighted Properties at the Root. And that issue came up during the panel discussion. So I just want to close by saying the Mortgage Bankers Association is delighted to be part of this program. We're delighted to work with so many great partners in the Memphis community. We look forward to being engaged for many years to come. So thank you very much.